The wind crossed the empty plains of Kansas with a low hum, the kind that spoke of distance and old memories. The wooden sign by the dirt road leaned to one side, half buried in dust, showing the faint letters that once said Maple Hollow. Margaret slowed the truck and watched the little house ahead, its paint pale and peeling, its porch sagging just enough to tell of years gone by. She had signed the papers 2 weeks earlier, paying $1 single for what the bank called a property of no significant value. But for her, it was something else entirely. It was a beginning after too many endings. Her hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment before she turned off the engine. The air was still, dry and heavy with the scent of earth that had waited too long for rain. Margaret stepped out slowly, feeling the crunch of gravel under her shoes. The silence around her didn't feel lonely yet. It felt like a place that had forgotten sound. The old house watched her as she walked closer, its windows dark, its front door slightly open, as if it had been expecting someone. When she crossed the porch, the boards gave a soft groan beneath her feet. She pushed the door wider, and dust swirled in a narrow shaft of sunlight. Inside, the smell of wood and time filled the air. There were still marks on the walls where pictures had once hung, and a few forgotten nails caught the light like tiny stars. She could almost imagine the people who had lived here before her, a family maybe, with their laughter fading through the years, until only echoes were left. Margaret had lost count of how many houses she had lived in over the years, but none had ever felt like home. This one was different, not because it was beautiful, but because it was broken. She could fix broken things. That was all she had done since her husband passed. The nights had been long, the mornings heavy, and every day had felt like a road that went nowhere. The house, though, gave her something to do with her hands, something to quiet the thoughts that never stopped moving. She began cleaning the first room, moving slowly but with purpose. Each window she opened brought in a little more light, a little more air. Dust fell like fine snow over the furniture that had been left behind. There was an old rocking chair in the corner and a piano with missing keys. When she pressed one, the sound was weak but still alive. It made her smile for the first time in months. She whispered to the empty room that it was going to be all right now. Outside, the afternoon stretched across the plains, painting the sky with a pale blue. Margaret worked until the light began to fade. When she finally stopped, she sat on the porch and watched the horizon. The wind was picking up, carrying the soft rustle of dry grass. She thought of how strange it was to buy a house for $1. Some said it was a miracle, others said it was a burden. The truth was still waiting in the quiet rooms behind her. The next morning began colder than she expected. The sun rose behind the fields with a shy glow, and frost clung to the wooden steps. She made herself coffee on a small stove she had brought and walked through the house again. The sound of her footsteps echoed slightly in the hallway. It was then that she noticed a small door under the stairs, narrow, old, and almost hidden by a wooden cabinet. She hadn't seen it before. The handle was rusty, and the wood around it showed marks of time and use. She pulled the door open, and a faint smell of soil came up. Stairs led downward, steep and dark, into what looked like a basement. She hesitated for a second, holding the edge of the door, feeling a small chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning. Still, curiosity won over caution. She took a flashlight from her bag and pointed it down. The beam cut through the darkness, showing stone walls and something that looked like an old shelf. Margaret started down the steps carefully. The wood creaked under her weight, but it held. When she reached the bottom, the air felt thick and colder. The flashlight moved across the space, showing boxes stacked against the walls, a few old jars, and tools covered in dust. She took a slow breath. Then the light caught something on the far side, a shape on the wall, faint but clear. It was a name carved into the stone. She walked closer, brushing the surface with her hand. The letters were rough but deep enough to still be read. It said, Jonathan Reed. Beneath it, the year, 1948. The edges of the carving were worn smooth, as if someone had traced them many times. Margaret felt her stomach tighten a little. She didn't know any Jonathan Reed. The papers from the bank had listed the last owner as a company, not a person. She stepped back, her eyes fixed on the wall. It was only a name, yet something about it felt alive, as if it hadn't been written just for memory, but for a reason. The air in the basement grew still, and she turned off the flashlight for a moment. In the dark, she could hear faint sounds. Maybe the house settling, maybe something else. She turned the light back on and whispered the name once more. It didn't echo. It just stayed there, between her and the wall, quiet and solid. Margaret spent the next few hours trying to distract herself with chores. She cleaned the kitchen, swept the floor, and sorted through boxes that had been left behind. But her thoughts kept drifting back to that name. She wondered who Jonathan Reed had been. Maybe a farmer, maybe the first owner, maybe someone who had built the place by hand. The house seemed too small for grand stories, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that every corner held one. That night, the wind returned stronger. It hit the windows and carried a low whistling sound through the cracks. She sat in the living room with a blanket around her shoulders, listening. The piano in the corner gave a faint vibration, as if one of its strings had caught the breeze. When she finally stood up to check the doors, she saw something on the wall she hadn't noticed before. Above the doorway leading to the kitchen, faint but visible under the paint, were the same letters she had seen downstairs, J.R. She froze for a moment. It could have been coincidence. Maybe someone had painted over old initials and time had brought them back out, but they looked too deliberate. She traced them with her fingers, and the wall felt colder there than anywhere else. Her breath slowed. For the first time since she arrived, she felt the weight of being alone in that house. Still, she refused to be frightened. Fear, she thought, was just another way to stay stuck in the past. She whispered softly that she meant no harm to whoever had once lived here. Then she turned off the lights and went to bed. The floor creaked as she walked, but she told herself it was just the wood, nothing more. In the morning, the world looked calm again. The sunlight through the kitchen window was warm and golden, and the wind had quieted down. Margaret made herself breakfast and sat at the table with a small notebook. She wrote the name she had found, Jonathan Reed, and drew a small line under it. Maybe she could look for records in town, see who he was. She liked answers. Answers made things feel safe. Outside, a truck drove by slowly, raising a small cloud of dust. The driver waved, and she waved back. It reminded her that even in places like this, there was still life beyond her front door. But as she looked back toward the basement door, a part of her knew that something in this house had been waiting far longer than she had, and whatever story it carried wasn't finished yet. She folded the notebook, placed it on the counter, and smiled faintly. "Let's find out who you were, Mr. Reed," she whispered. The wind outside gave a soft sigh, like a breath drawn in before a word unspoken. Margaret spent the following days trying to make the old house feel alive again. Every morning began the same way. A cup of coffee warming her hands, the sound of birds scattered across the wide fields, and the soft light moving slowly through dusty curtains. The air inside the house carried a faint scent of old pine and something deeper, a kind of age that no cleaning could erase. Still, she kept working. She believed that if she cared for the place, maybe it would care for her in return. She began with small things. She scrubbed the kitchen floor until the wood showed its grain again. She wiped the dust from the piano and fixed the loose leg on the rocking chair. She cleaned the windows until the light shone freely. Each sound, a broom against the floor, a window creaking open, made the house feel a little less like a stranger. Yet, no matter how much she did, she couldn't shake the presence of that name carved into the basement wall. At night, when everything grew quiet, she often thought she heard soft noises from below. It was never clear, just faint shifts, like the whisper of something moving through memory. Once she went down to check, flashlight in hand, and found nothing different. But when she turned to go back up, she noticed a new detail, a small framed photograph leaning against the wall behind one of the boxes. The frame was cracked, its glass fogged, but she could still see the image inside. It showed a man standing in front of the very same house she now owned. His expression was calm, proud even, and behind him stood a young woman holding a child. On the bottom of the photo, written in faint pencil, were the words, "Home, 1948. Margaret stared at it for a long time. The man could have been Jonathan Reed. The year matched the one carved into the wall. She brought the photo upstairs, cleaned the frame, and placed it on the table. The faces in the image felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Maybe it was just the quiet expression of the woman, or the simple way the man held his hands, steady, protective. She wondered what had happened to them, and why the house had ended up abandoned for so long. Later that afternoon, she decided to visit the town's small library. It stood near the edge of Main Street, a low brick building surrounded by leafless trees. The librarian, an older man with kind eyes, looked up when she entered. She asked him if he knew anything about a man named Jonathan Reed who might have lived near Maple Hollow. He thought for a moment before walking to a dusty shelf. He returned with a thin, yellowed record book. "That name does ring a bell," he said softly. He turned a few pages, then stopped. "Here," he pointed. "Jonathan Reed, registered farmer, 1946 to 1950. Property foreclosed after a fire. Family status, unknown." A fire. The word stayed in her mind. Did it say what caused it? She asked. The librarian shook his head. Just accidental fire. Basement origin. The property was left unclaimed after that. When she drove back home that evening, the horizon was glowing with the orange of the setting sun. The road was empty, and the house looked smaller in the distance, almost shy against the wide sky. The thought of the fire followed her, a fire that had started in the basement, the same place where his name remained carved in stone. That night, the air turned cold again. The wind pushed softly against the walls, and a thin fog settled across the yard. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the photograph beside her, a single candle lighting the room. She tried to imagine the night of the fire, the smoke, the noise, the panic, and wondered who had survived. The newspaper might hold more answers, but something inside her hesitated. Sometimes the truth was heavier than silence. Still, she couldn't stop wondering. Why was his name carved there? Why did the wall still hold it so clearly after decades? And why had the bank given the house away for $1, as if it carried a burden they wanted to pass on quickly? The candlelight flickered, as if stirred by a breath. She glanced toward the hallway. The basement door stood closed, but the faint outline of it seemed darker than before. She got up and approached it slowly. Her hand rested on the knob, cold under her fingers. She turned it halfway, then stopped. For a moment, she felt she shouldn't open it again. Not yet. She whispered softly, "Tomorrow." Then she went back to her chair, turned off the light, and sat in the dark until sleep came. The next morning, the sun rose weak behind a layer of clouds. Margaret woke early and walked outside. The air smelled of damp earth, and the ground was soft from a light rain that had fallen overnight. She stood for a while looking at the fields stretching endlessly beyond her fence. The silence felt heavier than usual, but peaceful in its own way. She told herself that fear was not going to keep her from living. After breakfast, she returned to the basement. This time she brought a lantern instead of a flashlight. The steps groaned beneath her weight, and the cold air greeted her like an old secret. She walked to the wall where the name was carved. For the first time, she noticed something faint beneath the letters, a small symbol, almost hidden in the stone. It looked like a cross surrounded by a circle. She traced it with her finger. The stone felt slightly warm, which made no sense in the chill of the basement. She stood there for several minutes, the flame of the lantern steady beside her. There was no sign of any damage from the supposed fire, no blackened marks, no smoke stains, nothing. It was as if the fire had been erased from the walls, but not from memory. Margaret found herself speaking out loud. "If you lived here, Jonathan," she said softly, "I hope you found peace." The silence that followed was deep. Then, from somewhere behind her, came the soft sound of wood shifting. She turned sharply, raising the lantern. The light fell on a small shelf near the back wall. One of the boards had tilted forward slightly, showing a dark space behind it. Her heart quickened. She placed the lantern down and pulled the board aside. Inside, she found a small metal box, old and covered with rust. It was locked, but the clasp was fragile. With a gentle pull, It opened. Inside were a few folded papers and a ring. The ring was simple, gold, and engraved with two initials, JR and ER. She unfolded the papers carefully. They were letters, written in fading ink. The first one began, "To my dearest Evelyn, if this finds you, know that I never meant to leave you without goodbye." Margaret's breath caught. The handwriting trembled slightly, as if written in haste. She read on. The letter spoke of a debt, of someone who wanted the land, of a fire that was not an accident. It ended with the words, "If the house ever stands again, it will remember us." Margaret pressed the paper against her chest, her mind spinning. Evelyn, that must have been the woman in the photograph. Jonathan's wife. So the fire hadn't been an accident. Someone had wanted them gone. And now, decades later, their story had found her. She placed the box back where she found it, but took the ring with her. When she reached the top of the stairs, she felt a strange calm. She didn't understand why, but it felt like she had just answered a call that had waited far too long. As she sat by the window that night, the ring resting in her palm, she thought of how the house seemed to be breathing differently now. Softer, lighter. It was as if the truth had loosened something in its walls. Maybe that was what stories did. They freed what had been buried. Where in the world are you watching from? Leave it down below in the comments. The sun rose slowly over the Kansas plains, stretching a pale light across the fields that surrounded the small house. The air carried the faint smell of rain mixed with dry grass, and the morning was calm enough to make the world seem paused. Margaret stood by the window holding her cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the distance where the land disappeared into the horizon. The house behind her was silent, filled with the soft echo of its own memories. She had spent the night thinking about what she had found in the basement, the letter, the ring, and the name carved into the wall. Every piece felt like a voice from another time, calling softly for someone to listen. She placed the cup down and walked toward the table. The photograph of Jonathan and Evelyn Reed lay beside the ring, both resting on a folded cloth. Margaret looked at the faces in the picture again. The man stood tall, his hand resting on the woman's shoulder, and the little boy between them held a toy horse. The simplicity of their posture made her feel the weight of the years that had passed since that moment. They had been alive once, laughing, working, building this same home. Now all that remained was a name carved into stone and a ring that refused to rust. Margaret sat down, opened her notebook and began to write. She wanted to record everything she had found. The sound of her pencil against the paper filled the quiet room. She wrote about the basement, the letters, and the strange warmth she had felt when she touched the wall. The more she wrote, the more she understood that this was no longer just about her new beginning. It was about giving closure to someone who never received it. She felt a calm determination growing inside her. For the first time in many years, she had a reason to stay in one place. When the sun climbed higher, she put on her jacket and drove into town. The road was empty, lined with trees that leaned slightly from the weight of the wind. The town was small, almost unchanged by time. The buildings carried the color of dust, and the people she passed greeted her with nods and quiet smiles. She parked near the old library and walked inside. The wooden floor creaked under her steps, and the faint smell of paper filled the air. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and glasses resting at the tip of her nose, looked up when Margaret entered. She asked if there were any old records about a family named Reed who had lived on the Maple Hollow property. The librarian hesitated for a moment and then pointed her toward the local archives in the back room. The room was small and filled with boxes of old newspapers tied together with string. Margaret started searching through them, her fingers brushing over headlines covered with the dust of decades. After an hour, she found it. The front page of an edition from October 1950 carried the words that made her heart sink. Fire destroys Reed farmhouse, family presumed dead. The article was brief, written in a tone too formal for the tragedy it described. It said the fire had started shortly after midnight and spread quickly through the wooden structure. Neighbors saw the flames but could not reach the place in time. The cause was listed as unknown, though one line near the end mentioned an ongoing dispute over the property. Margaret read the article 3 times. Her eyes lingered on the words property dispute. It connected directly to the letter she had found. Jonathan Reed had written about a debt, about someone wanting the land, and about a fire that was not an accident. The official report might have buried the truth, but the words in that letter spoke louder than any record. She folded the newspaper carefully and asked for a copy to take home. The drive back felt longer than before. The sky was turning grey, and the wind carried thin lines of dust that moved across the road like old ghosts. When she arrived at the house, she stopped the truck and stayed inside for a moment, watching the front porch sway gently in the breeze. She wondered if Jonathan or Evelyn had once stood there watching the same sky before everything changed. Inside, the air was colder. She lit a small fire in the stove and sat near it, holding the photograph once more. The faces in the picture no longer looked distant to her. They looked like neighbors, like friends she should have known. She whispered softly, "I found your story." The flames reflected on the glass, making it seem as if the photograph itself was alive. When night came, the sound of wind against the house returned. It crept through the cracks in the windows and moved faintly through the hallway. Margaret walked toward the basement door, her lantern casting a soft glow ahead. She opened the door slowly, listening to the quiet that followed. The steps below waited, dark and still. She took a deep breath and went down again, her hand brushing the wall for balance. The basement smelled of cold stone and earth. She set the lantern on the ground and its light reached the far corners of the room. The boxes and shelves were still there, untouched. The name carved into the wall stood clear and sharp, as if time had forgotten to erode it. Margaret knelt near it, running her hand gently across the letters. For a moment she thought she heard a faint sound, like a sigh carried through the air. It was gone as quickly as it came. She whispered, "I know what happened, Jonathan. I will not let your story fade." The silence that followed was deep, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like someone listening. She stayed there a long time, watching the flicker of the light against the stone, until the flame began to fade. When she returned upstairs, the clock on the wall ticked softly, marking a slow rhythm that comforted her. She made tea and sat by the window. Outside, the moon had risen, pale and distant. It cast a faint silver light across the fields, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin. As she sipped her tea, she thought about how lives could vanish and yet leave traces strong enough to call someone decades later. Maybe every place held memories waiting to be found by the right hands. The next morning, she decided to visit the county office. The building was small, with white paint peeling from the edges and an old flag waving tiredly outside. She requested the property records for Maple Hollow. The clerk, a young man with a quiet voice, went into the back room and returned with a folder of old documents. Margaret opened it and found the names written in fading ink. The last owner before the bank had been listed as Reed Family Holdings. The transfer after the fire went to a company she didn't recognize, and that company had later sold the land back to the bank. She noticed something else. A handwritten note attached to one of the pages said, "Claim disputed, evidence lost in fire." Her heart tightened. That line confirmed everything. The fire had erased more than a home. It had erased proof. Whoever had wanted the land had succeeded. Margaret thanked the clerk and returned home. As she approached the house, the sky grew darker, heavy with the promise of rain. Thunder rolled far away, slow and distant. She parked the truck and walked to the porch, standing there for a moment as the first drops began to fall. The rain hit the roof with a steady rhythm that filled the air with sound. She felt a strange comfort in it, as if the earth itself was finally washing away the years of silence that had covered the truth. Inside, she placed the copied newspaper and the county papers on the table beside the photograph. She lit a candle, watching the flame tremble slightly in the draught. The smell of rain mixed with the scent of old wood. The moment felt sacred in its simplicity. She took the ring again, turned it in her fingers, and whispered the initials engraved on it, J.R. and E.R. The letters caught the light. They were small, but they carried the weight of a promise that had never been fulfilled. She held the ring tightly, closed her eyes, and said softly, "You were never forgotten." A sudden gust of wind pressed against the window, making the flame flicker wildly. The candlelight danced across the walls, revealing faint patterns in the old paint. For an instant, she thought she saw the outline of two figures standing near the doorway. Not clear, not frightening, just the suggestion of presence. When she opened her eyes, the room was empty again. Margaret felt no fear. Instead, she felt peace, as if something had been acknowledged. She smiled faintly and sat back in her chair. The rain continued outside, steady and patient. The house no longer seemed like a stranger to her. It had become a keeper of truth, and she was now part of its memory. That night, when she finally went to bed, the sound of rain lulled her to sleep. In her dreams, she saw the house as it once had been, bright and alive, with laughter coming from the porch and the smell of bread baking in the kitchen. A man stood at the doorway holding a child, and a woman waved from the window. They looked toward her and smiled. She woke with tears on her face, but also with calm in her heart. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows again. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and bright. The fields shimmered with drops of water, and the world looked washed clean. Margaret stood by the window and whispered a quiet thank you. The past had spoken, and she had listened. The story of the house had begun to reveal itself, not through fear, but through faith. She believed now that some places were never truly abandoned. They waited patiently for someone willing to remember. The days that followed brought a quiet balance between the past and the present. Margaret moved through the old house with new purpose, her steps steady, her eyes softer than before. Each morning began with light entering through the kitchen window and spreading slowly across the floorboards that she had polished until they shone. The place no longer looked abandoned. The air smelled of coffee and wood instead of dust and forgotten years. The house had begun to breathe again, and in some silent way it seemed grateful. Margaret had learned long ago that when people carry pain for too long, they start to build walls around their hearts. She realized that the house had done the same. It had built its own walls of silence and shadow, protecting what it had lost. Now those walls were beginning to fall, not with noise but with the quiet patience of time. She could feel it each time the wind passed through the open windows, each time she heard the soft hum of the fields beyond the porch. She decided to restore the basement next. The thought of spending more time there used to make her uneasy, but that feeling had faded. She wanted to give that space new life. She cleaned the shelves, swept the floor, and carried the old boxes upstairs to sort through them. Some contained simple tools. Others held bits of metal, pieces of furniture, and scraps of fabric too worn to save. But one morning, while moving the last stack of boxes, she found something unexpected wedged behind them, a small wooden crate sealed with wire. She set it on the table and cut it open carefully. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a stack of notebooks. Their covers were rough and darkened with age, but when she opened the first one, the handwriting inside was clear and strong. The first line read, "The days grow long, but I still believe this land will forgive me." It was signed, Jonathan Reed. Her breath caught. These were his journals. She turned the pages slowly, reading about planting seasons, about struggles with the bank, about his wife Evelyn's garden that never stopped blooming even in the worst summers. Every page carried pieces of a man trying to hold on to hope while the world around him began to close in. One entry near the end spoke of a meeting with a man named Walker who had promised help but demanded the deed to the land as collateral. Another page spoke of fear, that the fire might come, that the threats were not empty. Margaret read until the light outside began to fade. She closed the notebook gently and looked around the room. The weight of what she had uncovered settled on her shoulders. She wasn't just restoring a house anymore. She was uncovering an injustice buried under decades of silence. That night, she placed the journals beside the photograph and the ring. The three objects together told a story that had once been erased. She lit a candle and sat by them for a long time, her reflection flickering in the window glass. She thought of Evelyn, the woman in the picture, holding her child with quiet grace. She thought of Jonathan writing by candlelight in the same house, unaware of how his words would one day reach another life. The next morning, the town was covered in mist. Margaret drove into town again, carrying one of the journals in her bag. She stopped at the small diner near the main road for breakfast. The air smelled of fried eggs and coffee, and a few locals sat quietly reading newspapers. As she sat by the window, she overheard two older men talking about the history of Maple Hollow. One of them mentioned the Reed family, saying his grandfather used to tell stories about the fire. Margaret turned toward them gently and asked if they knew what really happened. The taller man, wearing a brown hat, nodded slowly. "I don't know the truth for sure," he said, "but I heard it was no accident. My grandfather said the Reeds had trouble with a land broker, said the man wanted the property for himself. But when the fire came, that man disappeared a few weeks later. Folks said he left town before anyone asked questions." She thanked him quietly, finished her meal, and walked outside. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the sun just above the trees. The words of the old man stayed with her the entire drive home. It confirmed everything Jonathan had written. She had no doubt now that the fire had been deliberate and the people responsible had never been held accountable. Back at the house, she opened all the windows and let the wind fill the rooms. She felt the truth deserved air, not darkness. She decided to dedicate one wall in the living room to the Reeds. She placed the photograph in the center, surrounded by the letters, the ring, and the first journal. It became a quiet memorial, not to ghosts, but to justice finally remembered. For the first time since moving there, Margaret slept peacefully. No noises from the basement, no cold drafts through the hallway, no restless thoughts. The house seemed settled, as if it had finally found rest. The peace lasted for several days, until one evening when the weather changed again. The wind rose suddenly, bending the trees outside and pushing clouds across the darkening sky. Margaret sat by the fire reading one of Jonathan's journals. The flames flickered softly, and the sound of rain began to tap against the windows. She turned another page and found a letter folded inside. It was written in a trembling hand. The ink had bled slightly, but she could still read it. It said, "To whoever finds this home, please know we fought to protect what was ours. If this land stands again, it means truth survived. Let it be known that love was stronger than fire." She set the letter down slowly, her hands trembling. The message was not just for her eyes. It was meant for whoever would come after. It was meant to carry faith forward. She folded it back carefully and whispered, "It survived, Jonathan. It survived." As she spoke, thunder rolled outside, deep and slow. The candle on the table flickered violently before going out. The only light left was from the fire in the hearth. She stood up to close the windows when she noticed movement near the hallway. It wasn't sharp or frightening, just a soft reflection passing across the wall. She followed it with her eyes until it disappeared near the basement door. For a moment, she thought she imagined it, but when she looked closer, she noticed the door was slightly open. She walked toward it and called softly, "If you are here, you can rest now." The wind outside calmed almost instantly, and the room grew quiet again. She closed the door gently and turned back toward the living room. The fire had settled into steady embers, and the rain began to slow. That night, she dreamed again of the house, not as it had been when she found it, but as it once was. She saw the porch full of flowers, the sound of laughter, and the glow of lanterns through open windows. Jonathan was there, sitting by the piano, while Evelyn stood near the door holding the boy. They looked happy, untouched by what was to come. When Margaret woke, she felt warmth spreading through her chest, the kind that comes from understanding something deeply true. The morning that followed was bright and clear. The storm had washed the air clean. Birds returned to the fields, and the smell of wet grass filled the breeze. Margaret stepped outside and looked at the horizon. The house behind her stood strong and calm, its wood glistening faintly in the light. She realized she was no longer just a visitor here. She was part of its story now. Later that day, she returned to town to share what she had found. She visited the library again and showed the journals to the librarian. The woman's eyes widened as she read the first pages. She promised to include the Reed's story in the town's historical records. "It's time their names were remembered," she said. Margaret nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. She had done what she came to do. even if she hadn't known it at first. That evening, back at home, she sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky turned shades of gold and soft rose, and the world seemed peaceful. She held the last journal in her lap and read one final line aloud: "The land will heal when truth is spoken." Margaret closed the notebook slowly. The fields stretched endlessly before her, glowing under the last light of day. She whispered, "It healed, Jonathan. It truly did." As night approached, the first stars appeared above the plains, and the house stood quietly behind her, no longer heavy with memory, but light with peace. The next morning began with a sky so clear it looked freshly washed by the rain. The air carried a faint chill, and sunlight reflected over the damp grass like thin lines of silver. Margaret stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands and felt the calm that had settled inside the house. The land seemed to breathe differently now, lighter, freer. The silence that once felt heavy now sounded peaceful, almost protective. She thought about how much had changed since the day she first arrived, when the place looked broken and forgotten. Now it carried warmth again, and that warmth had slowly returned to her as well. She walked through the rooms, letting her fingers brush the wooden walls. Every corner seemed to have softened since she learned the truth about the Reeds. The fear she once felt in the basement had vanished completely. Instead, she felt gratitude, as if the house itself had thanked her for listening. The air no longer smelled of dust, but of old pine, and the faint sweetness of wax from the candles she had burned each night. The sound of the floor under her feet no longer creaked like complaint, but sighed with rest. Margaret decided to spend the day in the garden behind the house. It had been overrun with weeds when she arrived, but beneath the tangle of vines she could still see traces of what once had been planted there. She found the outline of a small path made of stones and the remains of a fence half buried in the soil. She worked for hours pulling weeds, turning the soil, and planting new seeds she had bought from town. The sun climbed slowly, and time seemed to stretch in long, calm minutes. She thought of Evelyn tending to this same garden years ago, and wondered what flowers had once bloomed here. When she finished, she sat under the shade of an old oak tree near the back of the yard. The breeze rustled through the leaves with a steady rhythm, and the air smelled clean and alive. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint cry of a hawk. The world felt honest in that silence, full of both loss and life. It was then she realized that this house had given her more than a place to live. It had given her peace, and peace had been missing from her heart for a long time. In the afternoon, she went back inside to organize the last of the papers she had collected. She had spread them across the kitchen table: the newspaper clipping, the letter, the journals, and the copy of the county records. As she looked over everything, she noticed something she had missed before. One of the old envelopes from the basement had another sheet folded inside it. When she opened it, she found a list written in Jonathan's handwriting. It looked like names and dates, all neatly aligned in rows. At the bottom of the list was a final note: "Debt settled, forgiveness granted. May those who wronged us find peace only through truth." Margaret stared at the page for a long time. She didn't know who those names belonged to, but she understood what it meant. Jonathan hadn't written with bitterness. Even after the fire, even after losing everything, he had still written the words, "Forgiveness granted." It struck her deeply. She had met many people in her life who carried resentment until it destroyed them from the inside. But here was a man who had lost everything and still believed in mercy. That night, she placed the letter beside the journals and sat quietly by the fire. The flames moved gently, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The warmth wrapped around her like an embrace. She whispered, "You were stronger than they ever were, Jonathan. You and Evelyn both." Her voice trembled slightly, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from admiration. The story she had uncovered was no longer only about tragedy. It was about faith and the quiet endurance that holds people together when everything else falls apart. Later, she stepped outside again. The moon hung low, round and bright above the fields. The air was cool, carrying the scent of soil and distant rain. She walked toward the old fence line and stood there looking out at the land that had once been fought over, burned, and lost. She felt a strange connection to it, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Maybe she had been meant to find this place, to give voice to those who had been silenced. The days turned into weeks, and Margaret's life began to follow a quiet rhythm. She woke early, worked in the garden, read the journals, and sometimes went into town to talk with the librarian or the pastor from the small church nearby. Word of the story began to spread slowly among the townspeople. People who had never spoken about the fire started to remember small details. How the night sky had glowed red, how smoke had carried across the fields, how the sheriff had closed the case too quickly. One woman even brought Margaret an old photograph showing a barn that once stood on the property before the fire. Each piece added another layer to the truth. The pastor, an older man named Lewis, came to visit one afternoon. He walked through the house slowly, touching the wooden frames and admiring the care she had given the place. When she told him everything she had discovered, he listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Sometimes God lets certain stories stay hidden until the right person comes along to reveal them. Maybe this was never just a house for you. Maybe it was a calling." His words stayed with her long after he left. That night she sat on the porch again, thinking about what he said. She realized he was right. She hadn't just stumbled upon this place. She had been guided to it. Every pain she had carried, every loss she had endured, had brought her here to help a family find peace long after they were gone. It gave her life a new kind of purpose, quiet but real. A few days later, she decided to organize a small gathering at the church to share the Reeds' story. She brought the photograph, the letters, and one of the journals. People filled the pews quietly, listening as she spoke about what had happened on the land so many years ago. She didn't speak with anger or blame. She spoke with reverence, with gentleness, and with the hope that truth could heal even what had burned away. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before someone began to clap softly. Others joined, not for applause but for respect. After the service, several townspeople came to thank her. One woman, who said her grandfather had known the Reeds, handed Margaret a small cross carved from wood. "He made this before the fire," the woman said. "It belonged here more than anywhere else." Margaret accepted it and promised to hang it inside the house. That night, she placed it above the basement door, where the air was always cool and still. Days passed, and life continued quietly. The house no longer felt haunted by sorrow. It felt whole. Margaret often found herself humming while she worked, something she hadn't done in years. The garden flourished, filling the air with color and scent. The piano she had once feared to touch now carried soft melodies in the evenings, notes rising gently through open windows into the calm Kansas sky. One evening near sunset, she sat by the window, writing in her notebook. She wanted to record everything that had happened since she moved in, from the first day to the present moment. Her words filled the pages slowly, each sentence steady and full. As she finished, she wrote one last line. "Sometimes the past doesn't ask for revenge, only remembrance." She closed the notebook and looked toward the basement door, where the small wooden cross hung glowing faintly in the last light of the day. Outside, the wind moved gently across the fields, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and rain. The sound was soft, like a lullaby. Margaret whispered to herself, "You're home now, all of you." And for the first time in a very long time, she truly believed she was home too. The night fell calm and quiet. The stars covered the sky like small points of forgiveness, and the house stood strong against the dark, no longer hiding secrets, but keeping memories safe. Margaret sat by the fire until sleep came softly, her heart resting with the peace she had given back to others. The following morning, the sky opened with a golden glow that touched everything around the house. Dew still covered the grass, and the air carried the crisp scent of soil that had been watered through the night. Margaret stood outside, watching the light spread across the land like a quiet blessing. The world seemed calm again, the kind of calm that follows after a story has been told and understood. She felt lighter than she had in years, not because the past was gone, but because it had finally found its place. She spent part of the morning walking through the garden she had planted weeks earlier. The flowers had begun to bloom, their colors spreading softly across the soil. Some were small and fragile, others strong and bright, but together they painted the space with life. As she watered them, she thought about Evelyn and how she must have once done the same thing in this very spot. She could almost imagine her voice calling to the child from the porch, the smell of bread baking from the kitchen, the laughter that would have filled the afternoon air. After lunch, Margaret decided to clean the attic. It was the last part of the house she hadn't touched yet. The narrow stairs creaked under her feet as she climbed. The attic was filled with old furniture, broken chairs, and a trunk covered with a thick layer of dust. The air smelled of cedar and age. She opened one of the small windows to let the sunlight in, and thin beams of gold cut through the shadows. For a moment, everything looked frozen in time. She began sorting through the items one by one. Most of what she found were pieces of everyday life, books too fragile to open, jars of nails, worn-out blankets. Then she reached the large trunk in the corner. The lock had rusted away long ago. She lifted the lid slowly, and a soft smell of old paper filled the air. Inside were more journals, photographs, and a few objects carefully wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped one of them and found a small wooden frame holding a faded drawing of the farmhouse. The signature at the bottom read, "Evelyn Reed." Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. It wasn't a photograph, it was a drawing made by someone who loved this place deeply. The details were precise. The porch, the fence, the tree line. But what caught her attention was something near the bottom corner of the drawing. There was a small outline of a figure standing by the basement door, almost invisible, drawn with faint pencil strokes. It was a man, and though his face was unclear, the stance looked familiar. Margaret traced the figure with her finger, her mind filling with questions. Maybe Evelyn had drawn it as a memory of Jonathan. Maybe she had made it after the fire, as a way to hold on to what was lost. She placed the drawing aside and continued looking through the trunk. She found more letters written in the same delicate handwriting, addressed to someone named Thomas. They were dated from years before the fire. The letters spoke of everyday life, love, and hope. The last one, however, ended differently. It said, "If anything happens, promise me you will keep the land. Promise me you will not let them erase us." Margaret sat back and looked around the attic. The quiet around her felt deeper now. The house wasn't just a house. It was a vessel of promises and prayers that had survived time and loss. She gathered the letters and carried them downstairs. She wanted to keep them near the journals and the photograph. Each piece connected the story more clearly. As she reached the kitchen, she noticed something unusual. The ring that had been resting on the table was no longer where she had left it. She looked around carefully, thinking she might have moved it without realizing, but it was gone. The surface of the table was empty except for the candle and the notebook. For a moment, her heart quickened. Then she smiled faintly, telling herself it didn't matter. If it was gone, maybe it had gone where it belonged. That evening, Pastor Lewis visited again. He brought a basket of apples from his orchard and sat with her on the porch. The sun was low, painting the sky with deep orange light. Margaret told him about the attic, the letters and the drawing. He listened quietly, nodding from time to time. When she finished, he said softly, "It seems you've given this place a new soul. You found what was buried, not just in the earth but in spirit. Maybe that is what forgiveness looks like when it takes root." She looked out across the fields and said, "I think this land waited for someone to remember." He smiled gently. It did. Some stories don't end, they rest. "And you woke this one." After he left, Margaret stayed outside, watching the stars appear one by one. The air was cool, the kind of cool that feels like peace rather than emptiness. She thought about how her life had been before she came here, full of wandering and quiet loneliness. Now the loneliness had changed shape. It was still there, but it was no longer painful. It was gentle, like a space where something sacred could breathe. The next morning, she went into town to buy paint and supplies. She wanted to repair the outside of the house before winter came. The people in town greeted her differently now. They no longer saw her as a stranger. They asked about the house, about the garden, about the Reed story. Some even offered to help with the repairs. Margaret thanked them kindly, but preferred to work on her own. She found comfort in the quiet rhythm of her hands. Over the following days, she painted the porch, mended the fence, and replaced broken shingles. Each stroke of paint and each nail she hammered felt like an act of gratitude. The sound of her work blended with the wind, with the hum of insects, with the soft song of the land that had finally found its voice again. One afternoon, as she painted the window frames, she caught a glimpse of something moving near the edge of the field. It looked like a shadow passing through the tall grass. She squinted against the light, but it was gone before she could be sure. It didn't frighten her. It felt more like a quiet reminder that she was not truly alone here. When evening came, she went inside and sat at the piano. She hadn't played much since she moved in, but something inside her urged her to press the keys. The sound was soft and hesitant at first, then steadier. The melody filled the house, echoing faintly down the hallway. It was not a song she recognized, but it came naturally, as if her fingers remembered something her mind did not. The music carried through the air and seemed to wrap around the walls like a promise kept. As the last note faded, she looked toward the basement door. For a brief second, she thought she saw a faint glow beneath it, like a candle burning quietly below. She didn't move, didn't speak. The glow flickered once and disappeared. Margaret smiled softly and whispered, "Rest easy now." That night, sleep came easily. The dreams that visited her were calm. She saw Evelyn standing in the garden, sunlight on her face, holding a handful of flowers. Jonathan stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. They looked at Margaret and nodded, their expressions gentle, their presence warm. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but felt no sadness. The tears carried peace. Morning arrived bright and clear again. Margaret stood by the window watching the world wake. The flowers in the garden moved gently in the breeze, and the wooden cross above the basement door caught the first light of the day. It glowed faintly for a moment, then faded as the sun grew stronger. The house had found its balance, and so had she. She knew that one day others would live here. They might never know the full story of Jonathan and Evelyn Reed, but the house would still remember. It would carry their names quietly in its walls, in the sound of its floors, in the warmth of its air, and maybe whoever came after would feel what she had felt, the sense that some places hold love long after the people are gone. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. The morning light filled the room, bright and calm. She opened her notebook and began to write again. She wrote about forgiveness, about how truth changes, not just the past, but the heart. Her words flowed easily like water finding its path. When she finished, she closed the notebook gently and whispered, "Thank you for letting me be part of this." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the sound of leaves rustling like a quiet hymn. Margaret smiled. The house no longer needed saving, and neither did she. Both had been redeemed by truth and by the simple act of remembering. Autumn began to stretch across the Kansas plains, bringing cooler winds and the golden smell of harvested fields. The leaves near the fence turned shades of amber and soft brown, falling one by one onto the ground that had finally learned peace. Margaret woke early each morning to the sound of distant roosters and the soft hum of the wind moving through dry grass. The air carried that quiet promise of change that only autumn brings, the reminder that time moves even when we wish it would rest. The house had become a part of her now. Every sound it made was familiar, every corner carried memory. She had painted the walls a warm shade of cream and placed small flowers near the windows to let the light catch their color. The house no longer seemed to belong to the past, but to both time and healing. It was no longer a symbol of tragedy. It had become a home built upon redemption. Margaret spent her mornings tending to the garden and her afternoons reading on the porch. The journals of Jonathan Reed remained near her chair, tied with a thin piece of ribbon. She often reread them, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Each word spoke to her like a conversation that crossed years. Sometimes she could almost hear his voice as she read, calm and thoughtful, describing the rhythm of the land and the lessons of faith that he had carried until the end. One afternoon, as she finished reading, she noticed a truck stop near her gate. A young man stepped out, wearing a dark jacket and holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a representative from the county's historical department. He had heard from Pastor Lewis and the librarian about her discovery of the Reed's journals and wanted permission to include them in an upcoming exhibit about local history. Margaret agreed, but asked that copies remain in the house. She wanted the Reed's words to stay where they had been written. The man nodded and promised they would honor her request. After he left, she sat for a long while in silence. The sound of his truck fading down the dirt road felt like another chapter closing. She realized that soon the story of the Reeds would no longer belong only to her and the house. It would belong to the town, to anyone who wanted to understand what faith and truth could endure. That thought filled her with quiet pride. She looked toward the horizon and whispered, "You're remembered now. The world will not forget you." The next few days passed in calm routine. Margaret began preparing for winter, sealing the windows and stacking wood for the stove. Each evening, she watched the sky fade into deep orange before night arrived with its silver stillness. One night, as she sat by the fire with her notebook, she decided to write her own letter, not for anyone in particular, but as a way of leaving behind something true, just as Jonathan had done. She began with simple words. "If someone finds this home after I am gone," she wrote, "know that it once carried both sorrow and grace. Know that forgiveness can rebuild what even fire destroyed." Her words came slowly, but with certainty. She folded the paper carefully and placed it inside one of the empty journals on the table. It felt right, as if she were adding her name to a story that would continue long after she was gone. The first frost arrived a week later. The fields shimmered under the pale morning light, and the sound of her footsteps on the porch echoed sharper in the cold air. She wore her wool coat and gloves and walked to the edge of the property to gather fallen branches. The air was still, and her breath came out in soft clouds. When she turned back toward the house, she noticed something small glinting in the grass near the oak tree. She bent down and picked it up. It was the ring, the same gold band engraved with JR and ER. The metal was clean, untouched by rust, as if time had never reached it. She had never found it after it vanished from the table, and now it rested in her palm, warm despite the cold air. Margaret closed her hand around it and smiled softly. "Welcome home," she whispered. That night, she placed the ring inside a small box and set it on the mantel above the fire. The candlelight reflected against it, creating a soft golden glow that filled the room with warmth. For a long time, she sat there in silence, watching the flames dance, feeling that she had finally completed something sacred. The winter days grew shorter, and nights arrived early. Margaret spent her evenings by the stove, reading, knitting, or simply listening to the sound of the wind brushing against the walls. The loneliness that had once haunted her was gone. What remained was solitude, but it was a kind that brought peace, not sorrow. One afternoon, Pastor Lewis visited again, bringing her a newspaper. On the front page was a photograph of the exhibit in town, a glass case containing the Reed's journals, letters, and a small plaque with their names. The headline read, "Maple Hollow Family Remembered After 70 Years. Margaret ran her fingers over the picture, feeling her throat tighten. Pastor Lewis smiled and said, "You gave them back their story." She looked at the photograph again and replied, "They gave me mine." That night, after he left, the house felt unusually still. The air carried that familiar scent of old wood and faint smoke from the fire. She walked through each room slowly, touching the door frames, the walls, the furniture she had restored. She whispered thank you to each corner, as though the house could hear her. When she reached the basement door, she stopped. The wooden cross still hung above it, faintly glowing in the light of the fire behind her. She placed her hand gently on the door and said, "You're free now." The next morning, she woke early, before sunrise. The sky was grey and full of mist, and the world outside looked soft and quiet. She made coffee and sat by the window, holding the warm cup close to her chest. The land stretched endlessly before her, covered in frost that shimmered like glass. She thought of all that had happened since the day she bought the house for $1, how something so small had turned into something so meaningful. She realized that life was like that sometimes. The greatest changes often began with the smallest choices. She hadn't come here looking for miracles. She had only wanted a place to rest. But the house had given her something greater. It had given her a reason to believe that faith, no matter how quiet, could rebuild what time had broken. As the sun began to rise, a soft golden light broke through the mist. Margaret stood and opened the window. Cold air filled the room, sharp but clean. She breathed it in deeply, feeling her chest lift with quiet strength. She whispered softly, "We're still here." Later that day, she visited the cemetery near town, where a small plaque had been placed for the Reeds. The simple stone read, "Jonathan and Evelyn Reed, beloved family, remembered in faith." Margaret placed a bouquet of white flowers beside it and knelt quietly for a moment. The wind moved gently around her, lifting a few leaves into the air. She closed her eyes and said, "Your story lives here now. It will never fade." When she returned home that evening, the sky glowed deep orange once more. The house welcomed her with the familiar scent of wood and warmth. She lit a candle on the mantel, its flames steady and bright. She looked around and smiled, realizing that the story of the Reeds was now part of something eternal. It was no longer about loss. It was about grace. She sat by the window as night came again, writing in her notebook. Her final words for the day were simple. The house stood, and so did I. She closed the notebook gently, placed it on the table, and looked toward the basement door one last time. The cross above it caught a faint shimmer from the candlelight, a reminder that peace had truly returned. Outside, the stars began to appear again, one by one, over the quiet fields of Kansas. The wind moved softly, carrying the scent of earth, wood, and memory. Inside, Margaret rested in her chair, her eyes closing slowly, her heart calm. The story of the house that once cost $1 had become a story of worth beyond measure, a story of truth that refused to die, of love that had outlasted fire, and of faith that had rebuilt what the world tried to erase. Winter settled slowly over the plains, soft and unhurried. The days became shorter, the nights stretched longer, and the frost that gathered on the windows each morning turned the world into a quiet painting of white and silver. The fields around the house slept under a thin layer of snow, and the air carried the scent of smoke from nearby chimneys. Inside, Margaret moved carefully through each day, wrapped in the calm rhythm of her new life. The house no longer felt old or haunted. It felt steady, warm, and alive, like a living being that had finally learned how to rest. Each morning began with a fire in the stove, the smell of coffee filling the kitchen, and the sound of the kettle singing faintly. Margaret liked the stillness that came before the sun rose. The silence carried comfort instead of emptiness. She often sat by the window with her blanket over her shoulders, watching the first light touch the frozen ground. The world outside seemed to sleep peacefully, but she knew that beneath the snow, life waited patiently for spring. One afternoon, as the sky turned grey and heavy with the promise of snow, Margaret decided to bring the old journals down from the shelf. She opened one at random and began to read. Jonathan's words spoke of endurance, of long winters when hope had to be grown from faith alone. He wrote about how the land looked dead under the snow, but always came back to life when the frost melted. Faith, he wrote, is not in seeing what grows, but in believing what will. She closed the book gently, her eyes resting on the window where the snow had begun to fall. The flakes drifted slowly, carried by a quiet wind. She thought about those words and realized how true they were for her as well. She had lived many seasons of loss and silence, believing nothing would grow again. But she had been wrong. This house had become the soil where her peace had taken root. The snow continued through the evening, covering the steps, the garden, and the fence. The sound of it was almost nothing, a soft whisper that wrapped the land in stillness. Margaret sat by the fire with a candle burning beside her and wrote another page in her notebook. She wrote about gratitude, about the strength of small beginnings, and about the strange way pain often leads people back to where they were meant to be. Her handwriting was slow but steady, each word carrying the weight of something learned through time rather than taught by others. Later that night, the wind grew stronger and the lights flickered briefly. She went to check the windows, making sure they were secure. When she reached the hallway, she stopped in front of the basement door. The small cross above it glowed faintly in the light of the fire behind her. For a moment she remembered the fear she had once felt when she first saw that door, how heavy it had seemed, how full of unknowns. Now it was simply a door, nothing more, nothing less. She whispered, "Sleep well," and returned to her chair. The following days passed quietly. Snow covered the land in silence, and the world outside seemed frozen in time. Margaret kept busy with small tasks, repairing a loose handle, writing letters, baking bread. She had begun sending letters to nearby families, sharing the story of the Reeds and the lesson it carried. Some replied with kindness, others with stories of their own. It comforted her to know that the truth she had uncovered was still spreading, reaching people beyond the fence that surrounded her home. One morning, the sound of tires crunching through the snow reached her ears. She looked out the window and saw a car approaching slowly along the road. A woman stepped out, bundled in a thick coat, holding something in her hands. Margaret opened the door before the visitor could knock. The woman smiled and introduced herself as Sarah, the granddaughter of one of the men who had once worked for Jonathan Reed. She had heard the story through the church and had brought something she thought belonged to the house. From her coat pocket, she pulled a small key, worn and dark with age. "My grandfather found this in the barn the week after the fire," she said softly. "He kept it all his life, but always said it didn't belong to him. He asked me to return it if I ever learned who it belonged to." Margaret held the key carefully in her palm. It was small, simple, and cold, but when she turned it in her fingers, she felt a sense of recognition. The teeth of the key were slightly curved, and the metal was smooth from years of handling. She thanked Sarah warmly, invited her inside, and offered her tea. The two women talked for hours beside the fire, exchanging stories about the town, the families, and how every life seemed connected by invisible threads. When Sarah left, Margaret stood at the doorway, watching her car disappear into the white horizon. The house was quiet again, but her thoughts were alive with curiosity. She turned the key in her hand, wondering what it might open. She looked around, scanning the rooms she already knew by heart, and then her gaze fell on the small drawer built into the base of the old piano. She had never been able to open it before. The handle had always been stuck. She walked toward it, knelt down, and tried the key. It fit perfectly. With a slow turn, the drawer opened with a soft click. Inside lay a small velvet pouch, faded and dusty. She opened it carefully and found a silver locket inside. The chain was delicate, and the surface was engraved with 2 letters, E.R. Her fingers trembled as she opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of Evelyn Reed, smiling softly, her eyes full of life. On the opposite side was a pressed flower, perfectly preserved. Margaret held it against the light, and for a moment she felt the air around her grow warmer. It was as if the past had just placed its final piece in her hands. She placed the locket beside the ring on the mantel. Together they shone in the light of the fire. The story had come full circle. What had been lost was now found. What had been silenced was now spoken. She whispered, "You're whole again." That night, she wrote her final entry in the notebook she had started months ago. She wrote, "Some homes are not built of walls and roofs, but of the lives that shaped them. They survive through faith, through truth, and through those willing to listen." She closed the book, placed it beside the journals of Jonathan Reed, and looked around the room. Everything was still, yet everything seemed alive. As she prepared for bed, she paused one last time in front of the basement door. The air around it was calm and warm. The silence that filled the house was not the silence of absence, but of peace. She smiled, turned off the lamp, and walked down the hallway with quiet steps. The snow continued falling through the night, soft and endless. The world outside glowed faintly under the moonlight, and the small house in Maple Hollow stood strong against the cold. Inside, the fire burned low, steady and warm, its light flickering over the journals, the ring, the locket, and the cross. Together, they told a story of pain turned into grace, of injustice transformed into peace. Margaret slept soundly that night, the kind of sleep that comes only after a heart has finished its work. The land outside dreamed with her, wrapped in white silence, waiting for spring to come again. The first light of dawn crept gently through the frost on the windows, painting the kitchen in a faint golden hue. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving behind a landscape of perfect stillness. Margaret woke slowly, wrapped in warmth, and listened to the quiet rhythm of her home. The house seemed to hum softly, like it was breathing beside her. She rose, dressed, and walked to the kitchen, her steps steady and light. The kettle began to whistle, the familiar scent of coffee filled the air, and her thoughts moved peacefully between memory and gratitude. She opened the back door to look at the garden. The flowers she had planted months ago slept under a blanket of snow, hidden but alive. The air outside was crisp and sharp, touching her cheeks with the chill of winter. She stood for a moment, letting the cold remind her of how far she had come. The land that once carried a story of loss now carried one of faith and renewal. The past was no longer something to fear. It had become something to honor. When she stepped back inside, the warmth wrapped around her again. She placed the ring and the locket together on the table beside her notebook. The morning light touched them both, and they glowed softly, like small pieces of sunlight caught in metal. Margaret smiled and whispered, "You belong here." Her voice sounded calm and certain, the voice of someone who had made peace with time. That afternoon, she decided to visit the basement once more. She had not been down there for weeks, but something in her heart told her it was time. She took a lantern and opened the door slowly. The air below was cool, but no longer cold. The steps no longer groaned beneath her weight. They welcomed her instead. When she reached the bottom, the faint scent of wood and earth surrounded her. The walls looked the same, yet everything felt different. The carving on the wall was still there, the name Jonathan Reed deep in the stone. She traced each letter with her hand, feeling the roughness of the surface beneath her fingers. The symbol beside it, the cross within the circle, seemed softer now, as though the light had changed its shape. She knelt for a moment, closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer. She thanked the house for keeping its truth alive long enough for her to find it. She thanked the Reeds for trusting her with their story, and she thanked God for leading her to a place where faith could bloom again. As she stood, something caught her attention in the far corner of the room. It was a faint glimmer coming from beneath one of the wooden beams. She walked closer and saw that a piece of the stone floor had shifted slightly. She knelt again and brushed away the dust. Underneath, she found a small glass jar sealed with wax. Inside it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed by time. She broke the seal carefully and opened it. The handwriting was faint but still readable. It said, "If this house still stands, let whoever reads this know that we loved it until the end. We built it with our hands and with our faith. We leave it not in sorrow, but in hope that someone will carry that faith forward." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She pressed the paper gently to her chest and closed her eyes. It felt as though she were holding the heart of the house itself. She read the note again, then placed it back in the jar, sealing it with care. She returned it to the same spot and whispered, "Your faith did not end here. It grew." When she returned upstairs, the air in the house seemed lighter, as though the very walls had exhaled after years of holding their breath. She set the lantern on the table and sat down beside the fire. The snow outside had begun to melt slightly, and drops of water slid down the window panes like slow tears. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release. As evening came, Margaret lit a candle on the mantel. Its small flame flickered gently against the walls. She thought of the first time she had walked into the house, how empty and broken it had looked, how lost she had felt. Now, the same house glowed with warmth. It had changed because she had listened. She realized then that listening was a form of healing. To listen to the land, to the walls, to the silence, it was to give life back to what time had buried. The following week, the snow melted completely. The ground softened, and the air carried the smell of wet soil. Margaret began clearing the garden again, preparing it for spring. The work was slow, but it felt purposeful. Each seed she planted carried not only her hope, but the hope of the Reeds. She wanted the land to bloom again, not as it had before, but as something reborn through remembrance. One afternoon, while she was in the garden, a group of schoolchildren from town arrived with their teacher. They had come to visit the old Reed house as part of their local history project. Margaret welcomed them kindly, showing them the photograph, the journals, and the ring. She spoke simply, telling them how the truth had slept beneath the floors for many years until it was finally found. The children listened quietly, their faces bright with curiosity. When she finished, one of them asked, "So the house forgave?" Margaret smiled softly. "Yes," she said, "the house forgave, and so did I." When the children left, she stood at the gate and watched their footprints fade into the path. The laughter that followed them echoed gently in the air, a sound she knew the house had longed to hear again. For the first time in decades, its story had reached young ears, ears that would carry it forward. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, she sat on the porch with her notebook in her lap. The fields glowed with the last light of the day, and the wind moved gently across them like a calm tide. She wrote about what the children had asked, about forgiveness, about how some places learn to heal when people do. Her words came easily, steady, and sure. She ended the page with a single sentence: "The greatest redemption is remembering without pain." She closed the notebook and looked out at the land once more. The sky deepened into shades of purple and gold. She could hear the faint call of an owl and the steady rustle of the trees. Everything felt whole. The story had traveled through time and sorrow and found its way to peace. She was part of that peace now. When she finally went inside, she placed her notebook beside the locket and ring. The candle still burned on the mantel, its flame unwavering. She whispered, "You are remembered, and so am I." Then she turned off the lights, letting the glow of the fire guide her to bed. That night, she dreamed of the house one last time. It stood in full bloom, surrounded by wildflowers. Jonathan and Evelyn stood on the porch with their child, waving toward her. The walls gleamed with sunlight, and laughter filled the air. She walked toward them and felt warmth everywhere, a light that came from within the walls themselves. When she reached the steps, Evelyn spoke softly in her dream, saying, "You gave us back our home." Margaret smiled and whispered, "And you gave me back my life." Then the dream faded into brightness, and she woke with tears on her face and peace in her heart. The morning light entered the house like a quiet hymn, pure and gentle. She rose, made coffee, and looked around one more time. Everything stood exactly as it should. The journals rested neatly on the shelf, the ring and locket glowed faintly in the morning light, and the wooden cross above the basement door hung still. The story was complete. She stepped outside into the cold air, breathing deeply. The sky stretched endlessly above her, and the wind carried the scent of the earth beginning to wake again. She whispered into the open air, "It's all yours now." And for the first time, the house stood completely silent, not because it had something to hide, but because peace had finally filled every corner of its heart. Spring arrived quietly, as if the earth itself was waking after a long and gentle sleep. The air grew softer, and the snow melted into the soil, feeding the roots that had waited beneath it. The fields turned green again, and the wind carried the scent of new beginnings. Margaret spent her mornings watching the light spread slowly across the land, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea. The cold months were gone, and so was the weight that had once lived inside the walls of her home. The garden came alive faster than she expected. The flowers she had planted began to bloom in soft shades of white, yellow, and blue. Bees drifted lazily from one stem to another, and the fence that once looked grey now stood wrapped in vines and morning glories. Every sound seemed to carry life again. The singing of birds, the rustling of leaves, the quiet rhythm of water dripping from the roof after a brief rain. Margaret could feel that the house was no longer remembering sorrow. It was remembering joy. She began to open the windows more often, letting the wind move freely through the rooms. The smell of fresh air mixed with the faint scent of wood and earth. She moved through the house slowly each morning, touching the tables, the chairs, the walls, as if greeting old friends. On the mantel, the ring and the locket rested side by side, their metal bright under the sunlight. They no longer looked like relics from another life. They looked like proof that faith could outlast time itself. One afternoon, she decided to repaint the old front door. She chose a color that reminded her of the early morning sky, a soft blue that carried peace rather than brightness. As she painted, she thought about all that had happened since she first arrived. The fear, the mystery, the discovery, and finally the calm. Every brushstroke felt like gratitude expressed through color. By the time she finished, the sun had moved low in the sky, and the house looked almost new. As she stood back to look at her work, she noticed a car approaching slowly down the road. It stopped near the gate, and a man stepped out. He introduced himself as David Reed, a distant relative of Jonathan and Evelyn. He had heard about her through the historical exhibit and had traveled from another state to see the house where his ancestors once lived. Margaret welcomed him warmly and invited him inside. They walked through each room together, and she told him everything she had discovered: the letters, the journals, the photograph, the ring, the locket, and the note found beneath the floor. David listened with quiet reverence, his expression full of both awe and gratitude. When they reached the basement door, he stopped and looked at the cross hanging above it. "My grandfather used to talk about this place," he said softly. "He said it was built with love, not money. He would be glad to know it still stands." Margaret nodded and replied, "It does stand, and it still holds that love." They went down the stairs together, and when they reached the bottom, David knelt before the carved name on the wall. He placed his hand over the letters and closed his eyes. The silence that followed was deep but kind, like a prayer shared without words. When they came back upstairs, David thanked her. "You've done something extraordinary," he said. "You gave them their home back." Margaret smiled and answered, "They gave me mine." He looked around once more before leaving, his eyes lingering on the mantel where the ring and locket shone softly in the afternoon light. He promised to visit again in the summer and to bring the rest of his family. After he left, the house felt lighter than ever. It was as if the visit had completed something that had waited a long time to be fulfilled. The line of blood and memory had returned to its roots, and nothing more needed to be fixed or found. Margaret sat on the porch, the warm breeze brushing against her face, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She whispered to the open fields, "It's all finished now." That night, she cooked a small meal and ate by candlelight, her favorite way to end the day. The flame moved softly, reflecting on the glass of the window beside her. Outside, the stars glowed above the wide, quiet land. She looked toward the basement door one last time, and though it was closed, she could almost feel warmth coming from behind it. It was not the warmth of fire, but of peace, the kind that only forgiveness can bring. The following morning, she decided to write one final entry in her notebook. She began with steady hands and a heart filled with calm. "The house that was bought for $1 gave me everything that I had lost. It gave me faith again. It gave me purpose. It gave me proof that no pain lasts forever when truth and kindness remain." She signed her name beneath the last line and dated it, knowing it would be the final page of her story here. Later that day, she walked into the garden carrying the notebook. The flowers moved gently with the breeze, and sunlight shimmered over the soil. She knelt by the base of the oak tree and dug a small space between the roots. She placed the notebook inside a wooden box and buried it carefully, pressing the earth over it until it looked as though nothing had been disturbed. "Every story belongs to the land that holds it," she said quietly, "and this one has come home." As she stood, a light wind swept through the yard, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. She looked up and saw a hawk circling high in the sky. Its wings glistened against the light before it drifted farther toward the horizon. She watched until it became no more than a shadow, then turned back toward the house. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. Margaret sat on the porch, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes calm. The sunlight moved across the wooden boards, and the world seemed suspended in peace. In the distance, the fields stretched wide and endless, filled with quiet beauty. The house behind her stood steady, bathed in soft golden light. As evening came, the sky turned the color of honey, and the first stars began to appear. Margaret lit the small lamp by her chair and whispered a short prayer of thanks. She thanked the house for sheltering her, the reeds for their faith, and God for leading her there. She knew she had been part of something larger than herself, a story that had begun long before her and would continue long after. When night finally settled, she walked through the rooms one last time, touching the walls gently as she passed. She stopped by the mantel, where the ring and locket lay, and whispered, "Rest now." Then she turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the stillness, letting the soft darkness surround her. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the earth and the faint echo of distant songbirds preparing for another dawn. The story of the house was complete. The walls no longer whispered of pain but of peace, and the land that had once carried ashes now carried life. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that some miracles are quiet and some justice is simple. A house rebuilt, a story remembered, and a soul finally at rest. Summer came quietly to Maple Hollow, carrying long days and soft golden evenings. The fields swayed with tall grass, and the scent of wildflowers filled the wind. The sky above seemed endless, stretching in shades of blue that melted into the horizon. Margaret spent her mornings walking through the garden that had once been nothing but weeds and broken soil. Now it bloomed with life. The colors of the flowers reflected on her window panes, and bees moved lazily through the air, tracing small circles between petals. The house stood proud against the warmth of the season. Its paint gleamed in the sunlight, the porch boards shone, and every window carried the reflection of calm skies. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and oak, and the rooms were filled with the quiet hum of peace. The past no longer lingered in the corners. It had become part of the walls, settled and kind. The name carved into the basement stone was no longer a wound, but a signature, a mark of love that time had chosen to keep. Margaret woke each day with gratitude. She no longer kept count of time or days. The world had slowed for her, turning each hour into something to notice and appreciate. She found beauty in simple things: the sound of rain touching the roof, the feel of sunlight through the curtains, the laughter of children who sometimes passed by on their way to the fields. She had learned that peace was not the absence of memory, but the understanding that every story, no matter how painful, can end in grace. One warm afternoon, she received a letter. It was from David Reed, the man who had visited months before. He wrote that his family was well and that they planned to visit again soon. He also said the exhibit about his ancestors had brought people from nearby towns who wanted to learn about forgiveness and faith. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "Your kindness restored more than a home. It restored hope." Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the ring and locket on the mantel. She smiled softly and whispered, "Hope was always here. It just needed a voice." That evening, she sat on the porch as the sun began to set. The light poured across the land like gold, touching every blade of grass, every window, every memory that had once been buried in silence. The fields looked endless, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange. The air was still warm from the day, and she could hear the low hum of crickets beginning their nightly song. She opened her notebook and began to write once more, even though she had promised herself that her story was finished. But stories, she had come to understand, never truly end. They rest, waiting for another hand to turn the page. Her words flowed easily, calm and certain. She wrote about kindness, about faith, and about the way love can outlast fire, grief, and time. She wrote that some places are chosen not for what they offer, but for what they ask. That the land of the Reeds had asked her to remember, to forgive, and to believe again. When she finished writing, she closed the notebook and placed it beside her chair. The air around her felt alive, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. She leaned back and looked at the horizon. The stars began to appear, one by one, above the darkening sky. She thought of Jonathan and Evelyn and the life they had built here. She thought of how faith had carried them through loss and how their story had found its way back to light. Inside, the house was quiet, the faint glow of the lamp spilling across the wooden floor. The photograph of the Reeds hung on the wall near the piano, and beside it rested the cross that had once hung above the basement door. Everything that had once been hidden or broken now stood in the open, whole and beautiful. The piano, long silent, caught a stray gust of wind through the window, and one key pressed softly on its own. The sound was pure and gentle, fading into the air like a farewell. Margaret smiled and whispered, "Thank you." Then she closed her eyes and listened to the night. The next morning the sky was clear and bright. Pastor Lewis came by to bring her fresh bread from the church bakehouse. He knocked softly on the door, but there was no answer. When he stepped inside, the air felt still and warm, like the quiet after a prayer. Margaret sat in her chair by the window, her hands resting peacefully on her lap. The notebook lay open beside her, the last page filled with words written in her careful handwriting. It read, "The house stands, and so does faith. What was broken has been made whole, and what was forgotten has been remembered. The story is no longer mine. It belongs to the land, to God, and to those who believe that forgiveness can outlast time." Pastor Lewis bowed his head and whispered a prayer. He knew she had gone in peace. The light through the window fell gently across her face, and the breeze from the open door moved the curtains in slow, graceful waves. Outside, the fields shimmered in sunlight, and the flowers swayed as if the land itself were giving thanks. Word of Margaret's passing spread through town quickly. People came to the house in Maple Hollow to leave flowers at the gate. Some came out of gratitude, others out of curiosity, but all left with the same quiet feeling that something sacred had taken place there. The town decided to preserve the home as a place of remembrance. A small sign was placed near the porch that read, "The Reed House, a story of faith, forgiveness, and rebirth." Years passed, but the house never lost its warmth. The garden continued to bloom every spring. The oak tree grew taller, and the basement remained cool and silent, its name still carved deep in stone. Children from nearby schools often visited, their teachers telling them about the widow who bought the house for $1 and gave back to it something far greater, peace. On clear evenings, when the sun dipped low behind the hills, some said the house glowed faintly, as though it carried light within its walls. The wind around it always seemed to move gently, never harshly, and the air carried the faint scent of flowers long after they had withered. People who came to see it often spoke softly, as if not to disturb the stillness. They said the house felt alive, not haunted, but blessed, and perhaps it was. Perhaps every word Margaret had written, every prayer she had whispered, every act of kindness she had given, had soaked into the wood and the soil, becoming part of the place itself. The Reed's story and hers had merged into something eternal, a reminder that even the smallest acts of grace can outlive the people who give them. The wind continued to cross the plains, carrying dust, light, and memory. The house stood at the edge of the road, calm against the passing of time, its porch steady, its windows open to the world. And somewhere within its quiet heart, the echo of a piano key lingered, soft, pure, and eternal, a sound that spoke not of loss, but of everything that had been found.